Could World War II have been avoided via diplomacy? My friend Colin basically asked this question, uh, paraphrasing what he said. Watching videos and having conversations with me, he's noting that Germany in World War II was invading to gain resources so they could have proper socialism. Was there any room for Germany to make negotiations instead of war? Or was invasion the only route available? Frankly, I don't even know if more sociable methods were ever tried. So I'll answer the last part first, essentially talking about were negotiations ever tried? And the answer is yes. Prior to Churchill, the British and the Germans negotiated quite a bit. After Churchill was in place, the Germans did attempt to initiate negotiations, but as far as we know, Churchill never uh, reciprocated. From what we understand, Churchill basically was what we'd call a Teutonphobe, someone who hated Germans. Not feared them, but hated them. So, on certain levels, we'll never know exactly how serious these later negotiations were because, on one hand, Churchill was rebuffing them. On the other, we don't know if the Germans were completely serious about the offers they were making. Throw one little item in that mindset. Rudolf Hess, he was the National Socialist Chancellor of Germany who stole a plane, flew to England, and attempted to initiate negotiations. He was arrested and essentially held in prison till he died. And he actually was one of the few National Socialists that didn't really have a lot of blood on his hands. Uh, he was literally the last person held in the joint Allied prison. A lot of information dealing with him is still locked away. We don't even know much about his initial interrogations or anything along those lines. So, if we're ever to learn anything about these negotiations, it's going to take a massive release on the Brits' part to release that information, and it's going to probably take a sea change in British historians in order to interpret that. Uh, a good source for a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about is another channel called TIK History. Uh, very much a must watch in terms of uh, World War II battles, philosophies, economics, a lot of stuff you won't get elsewhere. Okay, so uh, you say invading to gain resources. This is absolutely correct. Part of this, we have to understand the importance of this is the difference between socialists and social democrats. Socialists are people who want the full socialist package as rapidly as possible. Social democrats are willing to piecemeal the socialist package together as long as they can get it democratically. So what we'll be talking about from here on in are not social democrats, but socialists, the people who want to put the socialist package together as quickly as possible. So let's get into what socialists in general believed, at least at that time period and somewhat before it. Socialists believe in a shrinking market theory. The shrinking market theory was the idea that as a nation industrialized, it would have less and less people and resources available to mine or produce natural resources itself and make food. So the belief in the shrinking market theory was if unchecked, eventually these industrial societies would be unable to feed themselves and supply the resources that their industry needed. So, to counter this, uh, socialists looked at the idea of autarky. And autarky is the idea that all the resources needed must be had at home somehow. This could either be via colonies, as Marx suggested, or as the National Socialists believed, it should be all under one big homeland. There should be absolute minimal to no international trade. All resources should be in the homeland. And once all the resources were there in one homeland, then and only then is full socialism possible. National Socialists believed that at some point war would probably be necessary, but not absolutely. So Adolf had the following views, and these are not views he completely put together on his own. There is a lot of National Socialist theorists that come before him that put all this together, and this is his spin on that. First, the strength of a nation was based on how Aryan the people were. Uh, Obviously, the Germans and the English are the most Aryan of them all, Norwegians to a certain extent. Their theory also went down to the idea that even Africans had a small bit of the Aryan spirit in them, whereas Jewish people had none. And to reemphasize, this is his theory, not mine. Essentially, the more Jews a nation had, the weaker the nation would be. He saw or foresaw a world of multiple great national socialist nations, uh, each nation with a sphere of resources under their belt. So his initial vision was nothing akin to world conquest. And uh, I'm sure it's essentially kind of a ludicrous goal. What Adolf described was a nation, basically big mega nations that had all the resources they need, functioning around the globe in their own little spheres. And once everybody was National Socialist, then there would be some form of world peace. Now, the key German deficiencies, as far as he was concerned, were food and oil. Germany did not have them. They were dependent on the world for them. So the two places he saw that these could be gotten from was the food from Ukraine and the oil from the Caucasus. Now you have to understand why he picked these places. They're not random. There are other places that are probably closer and easier to get at that he could have gotten these resources from, but he picks these ones. Why? Well, the Ukraine and the Caucasus are the only conclusion he can come up with because of how he saw the British Empire. First, the Brits are fellow Aryans. So he saw them as people he needed to cooperate with or at least be at peace with. Also recognizing that the strength of the British Empire was something they didn't want to go up against. He also recognized that the British Empire had all the resources it needed within its sphere, its colonies. So, therefore, if the British Empire ever started heading down the National Socialist path, they would become a functional socialist society because they were both Aryan and had all the resources. So the idea was that he did not want to compete for the resources that the British Empire already had. In order to not have conflict with the British Empire, he saw that taking Ukraine and the Caucasus, two places the British had nothing in and no ability to extract from, that they would be able to coexist. One of the things that he also recognized that prior to World War One, the German demand for overseas colonies put them into competition with the British Empire. So if they weren't interested in overseas empires, but overseas colonies, but uh, land areas similar to colonies that were part of the Eurasian landmass, again, they would not be in competition with the British Empire, and they would be able to basically do their thing on their own. So the Germans, and this is something he wrote in his book, His published book and his unpublished book. He actually wrote two. Most people don't know there was a sequel. Um, he made a point saying that the Germans would recognize the inviolability of the British sphere in exchange for the Brits recognizing the German sphere. The Germans were willing to accept the idea of naval inferiority and would not expand into France because of the Channel ports. The Channel ports in France were something that he knew that if the Germans occupied, the British would never accept. So we have a situation where this German National Socialist state is all set up to expand east. So, is this something that the British are willing to accept? So, if we look at the Brits during this same build-up period, the British establishment, their main goal, beyond all other things, was continental balance. They did not want to occupy the continent. They did not want forces on the continent. They wanted competing powers on the continent that did not have a distinct advantage over each other. The Continental Balance crowd in their establishment saw Russia as a looming threat. It was very populous. It was slowly getting organized, and if it ever industrialized, it would basically overwhelm Europe if it wanted to. To understand, the balancers ran all policy decisions in the British Empire. Now, what we are told is there was this group of sympathetic appeasers, and these were people who were kind of almost girlish in their, oh, the poor Germans, oh, look what the bad things we did to them in World War One. Let's make it up to them by giving them what they want, and then, they'll be happy and there won't be any war. The appeasers were a minority. The sympathetic, the Brits who were sympathetic to the German cause. They were never in the driver's seat. They were just along for the ride because the balancers wanted the same thing, but for different reasons. Now, when the war is all over, the appeasers become the scapegoat because the entire British establishment can't admit the fault they made in basically creating their own monster. The British recognized that the French were pretty much done as a continental power. World War I had sapped their strength. They'd lost almost 10% of their manpower. They were too shell shocked as a nation to be the one who'd be able to stand up to the Russians. Worse yet, the French were so terrified of the Germans that they would only look at Russia as a potential ally against the Germans. So we get to the balancers in the British establishment, and their goal was German rearmament. German rearmament was British policy. In order for there to be a counterbalancing power in Europe, they said it had to be a country in Central Europe. That country had to be Germany because it was the only country that had the population and the industry to do it. So rearmament occurred not because of happenstance or some kind of accident of history or because some sappy, whiny Brits who loved the Germans went, oh, let's let them rearm because it'll make us feel better. No, it was basically the hardcore realists saying, we need a strong Germany. A strong Germany has to rearm. Okay? Then the other idea comes up of Greater Germany, basically Germany reabsorbing essentially most of the elements of their pre-World War I empire, especially gathering up all the Germanic areas on their border. The British recognized that for the Germans to be a powerful central player, they needed the biggest population they could put together, and the more integrated that population was, being all German, the better they would be able to stand up to a future Russian foe. So, therefore, the idea of a greater Germany with all these extra land masses attached directly to Germany was British policy. It wasn't something they helplessly sat back and watched. It's something they encouraged and helped happen. So, along these lines, understanding that rearmament and Greater Germany were the British goal, first we see the basically the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, which allowed Germany to build a navy larger than the Versailles Treaty allowed. And they did it over the protests of the French. And the British accepted this treaty because the treaty specifically said that the Germans accepted the idea that the British would always have a significantly larger navy, and that this navy um, basically would not be challenged on the high seas. The treaty recognized the British sphere. So this fits in with how Adolf would have looked at things. He's saying, the British understand. We recognize their sphere, their empire, that we would not challenge them on the high seas. Clearly, they must be getting ready to recognize the sphere we want to set up. So, uh, the Germans were rearming. They weren't doing it out in the open, but pretty much all of Europe knew they were doing it. And Britain pretty much turned a blind eye to it. Every time France protested, the British said, hey, don't worry about it. The British were trading war material with the Germans, stuff they knew was going directly into their industry to make arms. There was no doubt in their minds. They could have easily shut Germany down by not giving them the stuff they needed. When it came down to the reoccupation of the Rhineland, once again, the French protested, and the Brits said, don't worry about it. All the stuff in complete violation of Versailles. All this stuff, the pre-German war, or the pre-World War I German people and resources were needed to create a power to rival Russia. Ultimately, once all these little bits of former Germany were cobbled together and put back into this greater Germany, the Germans were looking for what would they call the Danzig corridor, or the international corridor, which would allow them to build railways and highways on a line through Poland from Germany proper into East Prussia, where the port of Danzig existed. This is something the Germans made known to the British, and the British pretty much said, this is something that can happen. This is something we're open to. And the British very much viewed that Poland would eventually become a satellite of the Germans. It would be a front buffer zone that, once the Russians started their invasion, would give the Germans time to mobilize and run their troops up into defensive positions. Stuff all the British establishment was ready to deal with. All right. So now we have to look a little bit at National Socialist economic policies. Uh, we have autarky. So they're already trying to stop trade with the other nations. And the very first thing they do is with oil. They create the synthetic oil plants, even though it was far cheaper to trade with other people, because as socialists, they didn't care about the economics of it. They cared more about the fact that they could make their own oil at home. They figured they would make enough, store it, and have just enough to get to where they needed to go, and then they would be able to reap the benefits of the Caucasus once they got there. They had a 4-year plan that was essentially economically very much a disaster. Uh, and also, as a socialist country, the Germans were creating very lavish social programs that were costing them a fortune. Uh, their attempts at autarky, their 4-year plan, their lavish social benefits uh, came close to collapsing the economy several times. When Austria, the Czech Republic, specifically the Sudetenland, were incorporated, one of the first things that happened is the Germans took all their gold and seized what resources they could, and that's what helped keep things afloat. One of the big problems through this period is diplomats speak a different language than the rest of the world. They speak a very nuanced language. And the problem is although some of the diplomatic corps of the Germans were experienced diplomats, a lot of the National Socialists were complete newbies to the idea. So this nuanced language was kind of lost on them. They didn't follow it properly. And so, to a great extent, they misinterpreted the British willingness to help create Greater Germany as the Germans' will triumphing over the British. They didn't see it as the British giving them Greater Germany. They thought they were taking it. So after Sudetenland was taken, the British decided that they were not going to allow any more moves into the remains of what was now the Czechoslovak Republic. Essentially, as Czechoslovakia was pulled apart, it got renamed several times, depending on what parts of it were left. And so Hitler thought he had a loophole. It was okay, well, I won't invade them directly, but I will agitate them. And so he undermined the government, agitated all the neighbors to basically push to get their own little pieces of Czechoslovakia back. Hungary wanted pieces of former Hungary. The Poles want pieces of former Poland. And then there were other small minorities that he was pushing to agitate for their own autonomous zones. So, by massive diplomatic pressure, he ended up causing the Czechoslovak Republic to implode. And since it wasn't a true conquest, he figured the whole thing of the Danzig corridor and Danzig itself were still on the table. Uh, Essentially, the pieces that are left of the Czechoslovak Republic are two areas, call them provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. Uh, they were essentially afloat on their own without any real government. Their government had fled, and so the Germans declared them protectorates, meaning that the Germans would guarantee what sovereignty they had and set them up as puppets. And this completely caused the Brits to change their mind on how far they would let Germany go at this point. So at this point, the Germans are thinking, okay, we didn't conquer them. They fell apart and we just kind of took them via paperwork. So our deal with Poland is still on the line. However, the Brits were like, nope, this isn't happening anymore, or at least not in the world we're the way we're looking at things. So the Germans missed what was going on. They're hearing these objections about the Danzig corridor, but they thought they sounded exactly like the same fake objections the British were making when they went after Austria and the Sudetenland. So in their mind, the Danzig corridor deal was still open. So this opens up the what if sections. Is there room for diplomatic maneuvers that either stop World War One as it happened, delay it, or maybe stop it altogether? Okay, so what if the British had better explained their stance on Bohemia and Moravia? If they had better, if they understood what was going on and used language that the Germans understood, it is possible that Hitler would have never agitated to basically take out the rest of the Czechoslovak Republic. Without that, if they could have basically papered over that somehow and made it work, then the Danzig corridor would have still been on the table, meaning that the Germans would have eventually turned to the east and said, okay, we demand this corridor. And when the Polish said, well, what do we do? Then the Brits would have said, give it to them. this may have set things up to where peace would have lasted long enough that the Russians would have been the initiators of World War II rather than the Germans. Okay, so another what if? What if the Brits had renegotiated the Bohemia Moravia fiasco after the fact? So let's say things happen as they did historically. Hitler agitates, the Czechoslovak Republic implodes, and then he takes protectorate of the Bohemia and Moravia. What happens if the British had stepped in and said, look, you've crossed the line. We are not going to do the Polish deal unless we turn this into some kind of international zone where there's uh, British and French and other brigades in here, and maybe some other countries like Italy and other people to make it a whole international effort. We're not letting you have the appearance that you've taken these places over, and we're going to do it in such a way that you save face. You know, you're going to ask us to come in and help. We're going to help, but this is a bridge too far. We're not going to allow it. I think there's a good chance uh, the Germans would have taken this. I don't know how good. Probably not as good as if they would have worked this out beforehand. But after the fact, I think they still would have taken it if they understood the gravity of the situation. There's a chance that once they had taken this land and it was functioning under German control, they would have been very loath to give it back. But I'd say it's still very much possible. Another possibility is, so what happened with this fiasco with Bohemia and Moravia? What if completely after the fact? So here the Germans have declared them protectorates. Czechoslovakia is completely no more. The Czechoslovak Republic is no more. What if the Brits accept this as a fait accompli, where they say, okay, yeah, this has happened. It's you, yeah, you broke the eggs. Now you got to buy them. Uh, what if that point they said, look, we weren't happy about this. We didn't like what you did. We're going to allow this to happen, but you need to understand very strictly what you're being offered in Poland and what you're not. Uh, I think it's possible, once again, the Germans would have accepted this. Uh, they might have been a little bit dubious as to how much the British and French were able to enforce such a construct, but I imagine that they would have taken a freebie over war if it were offered. Okay, so here's another thought. Now, one of the big problems with the whole Polish situation is eventually the British and French guarantee its sovereignty, but they don't actually have the ability to do it. And one of the problems was the French and British completely overestimated how well Poland would do in a war against Germany. On paper, they looked like they were roughly equal, and they figured Poland on the defense would do pretty good and would be able to hold on for a long time while the British and French mobilized if it should come down to that. So the what if diplomacy is, let's say the Brits and the French actually move brigades over to Poland before the crisis starts. So the Germans are in control of Moravia and Bohemia in some form. Either it's an internationally occupied zone or they're protectorates as it historically came to be. But now there's actual French and British units stationed in Poland. And they make very clear here's what's going on. Yes, we're going to let you have the corridor to Danzig. We're going to change Danzig from a free port over to a German city. But if you invade Poland, you are going to be actually shooting at British and French soldiers. You'll be starting a war with all of us. I think that would have had a fairly good chance of delaying the war. I don't think Germany really wanted to be at war with either one of those at that time, if at all. I think what the National Socialists said about German, or excuse me, about Britain, their idea of respecting their sphere and the fact that they were fellow Aryans, I think they honestly believed to their core, and they would have accepted this as a deal. And this would have delayed the war almost to the point where the Russians come in, if not after. Now, one thing the British seemed to completely miss was the precarious nature of the economic system of National Socialism, that it was essentially always on the verge of a collapse, uh, because the world seemed to think National Socialism was working, because a lot of countries were looking at Germany saying, huh, what can we borrow from them to make this work? Now, there's a other side of a coin to this whole argument. We went over the diplomatic part. So I've pointed out where there are several diplomatic possibilities that could have happened that were plausible, some more than others. Now, talking about TIK history, uh, he has a theory that the German economy was on the edge of collapse in August of 1939. He believes that the reason the Germans were ready to go forward to war was because they didn't believe their economy would survive if they didn't go forward and basically steal another country and plunder it. I don't know if I buy that, but I find PIK's uh, logic very compelling, to the point where I think it's something that could have very well been a fact. I would need to see more to buy into it completely, but if that's the case, if that was really what was going on, then probably nothing would have stopped the Germans from going forward and starting a war. Now, one little addendum in terms of negotiations. Once the Germans had conquered Poland, they were once again negotiating with the British, hoping to create some kind of peaceful resolution. And this falls into that where I was talking earlier about how we don't know how serious it was, because we don't have the full idea of what was going on both sides. And by this time, we're starting to deal with Churchill, who I don't think he was exactly in charge at that point, but his faction was basically becoming dominant because of how poorly things had turned out. So there wasn't going to be a negotiation that worked at that point. Once France was conquered, then things go downhill, because even people who might have been willing to negotiate with the Germans would have been looking at those German occupied channel ports in France and said, no, there's no way in heck this is happening. But there was still a possibility. Now, let's imagine a scenario where somebody other than Churchill's in charge, somebody who's willing to weigh the pros and cons, someone who's looking at the whole continental balance thing still and doesn't have a complete hatred for the Germans. What if at this point, occupying France, the Germans said, look, we realize we can't stay in France and not be at war with England. What if we worked out a deal where some kind of international force occupied the channel ports, making them neutral? Therefore, we can't use them and threaten England. And we create some kind of pathway to the French to work their way towards elections, maybe in 10 years or after this war with the Russians is done. With the right people and the right language, that could have happened. I think it's very far fetched. It would have taken somebody in England basically recognizing just how much of a greater threat the Russians were than the Germans to be able to accept that idea for negotiations. However, as it was, uh, Germany was considered the much greater threat, so this wasn't going to happen. But I would say incredibly outside chance, outlier at best. So the answer is politically, yes, there were openings, and there were in a couple of cases where I think it was highly likely that the Germans and British could have come to some kind of solution that would have not caused World War II to happen the way it did. Now, if TIK is correct on the economic part, then there was probably no room for negotiation at all. So I hope that answers your question. If this raises more questions, either you can send them to me privately or you can throw them in the comments section. Anybody else who's watching this, feel free to comment. Is this new information to you? You have questions about some of it? Do you see any points where negotiations could have worked, or do you think there was just no way negotiations could have ever worked at all? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider checking out my other titles. You may find it a lot of things that you're willing to look at. Consider subscribing. If you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. And thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.